Hello and welcome again to another program of Searching for Answers, a program designed to help you, the viewer, as well as all of us here on the panel, to better understand the Bible. On my right is
Richard Rice, Loma Linda University.
And John Jones, the School of Religion at La Sierra University.
Bernard Taylor, Loma Linda University Church.
Ivan Blazin, Loma Linda University.
I would invite our viewing audience, all those that can hear it without viewing, please get your Bibles and go to the book of John in the New Testament. We have been studying all about John, and he is a wonderful disciple. I'm really impressed with this book. I'm sure all of us are. We are presently almost to the end of the book of John, so please turn to chapter 19, and we'll begin reading. I'll ask my good friend Rick Rice, would you begin reading with the beginning verse of chapter 19 in the book of John?
All right, I'll read the first 7 verses there.
Okay.
Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and striking him on the face. Pilate went out again and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God."
Would you continue on, John Jones,
Well,
please?
yes, there's much to talk about there, but we'll go a little further and then we'll back up and pull it together. Rick, I think you were reading from the New Revised Standard, it
I
sounded
was,
like,
correct.
and I'll continue in that same version. So, picking up with verse 8 now in John 19. Now, when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. And he entered his headquarters again, and he asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate, therefore, said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you, the power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin." And from then on, Pilate tried to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you're no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor."
When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat as a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week and about the 6th hour. "Here is our king," Pilate said to the Jews. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. You want to continue on, Bernard, please?
Sure. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus between them. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Then the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but this man said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scripture says, "They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." And that's what the soldiers did.
Interesting.
Ivan, would you read on a little bit, and then we're going to discuss what we've read.
Okay. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her into his home. After this, when Jesus knew all that was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit.
Interesting.
Isn't it amazing?
Just to read it is very touching.
Oh, it just brings tears to your eyes.
Yes.
It's terrible. And from what I understand, they had ways of torturing people before they crucified him, and even after they crucified him. And it's just awful, things that they did to those people on the cross.
Well,
But-
the beating, the scourging is one of the worst of all
One of
things.
the
Could be
worst
fatal.
of things.
It could
yeah.
be fatal.
That's
They'd
right.
have these long leather tongues and with maybe studded with
With
bone or with metal,
Metal. Yeah.
and they had no fixed amount. They could go as long as they wanted. And we have even accounts of some people whose whole inner anatomy was exposed. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Gruesome.
You know, an interesting little observation on John's literary technique emerges here. John, as you have just indicated, Carolyn, is a powerful writer. He writes well. This is not merely an exercise in artistry, it's an exercise in speaking to our hearts, but he uses artistry to do that. And so when we pick up in chapter 18 with his arrest and his appearance before the high priest, and follow down to as far as we have read, we find a curious little alternation back and forth of scenes. These are blocky little scenes for this and then in here and out in the courtyard and before the high priest. It's almost like a drama. And interestingly enough, they alternate between indoors and outdoors. Isn't that curious? You can pick up with verse 12 in chapter 18. The soldiers and their officer and the police arrest Jesus. That's outside in Gethsemane. Then in the courtyard, it continues, Peter denies Jesus. That's in the courtyard. But inside, beginning in verse 19, here is the scene in the trial, in the Sanhedrin. The high priest questions Jesus. But when we go to verse 25, we're back out in the courtyard again. It's kind of like when you used to listen, some people used to listen to the old Westerns on radio. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, you know how that goes. It's kind of like that back and forth. In verse 28, now Jesus goes they take him into the inner chamber, the headquarters of Pilate. Yeah. But then in verse 29, outside again. Pilate goes out and says to the crowd, what's the accusation? Verse 33, Pilate goes back inside and has this private conversation with Jesus, the two of them. But when we go down to the middle of verse 38, he went out to the Jews again, outside, and talks to them. Then inside, verse 1 of chapter 19, in the praetorium, in the flagstone courtyard, but it's inside the palace. The soldiers take Jesus and they mock him. But then he goes out and asks the people, "What shall I do?" They say, "Crucify him." Verse 8, Pilate is more afraid than ever. He goes back into his headquarters again and asks Jesus, "Where are you from?" And then again in verse 13 of chapter 9, back outside again to the crowd. The interesting kind of sharp cut, back intercutting. In Hollywood, they would call that intercutting of the scenes, back and forth. John uses it to good effect. The pace kind of quickens, back and forth. There's a sense of build-up, of drama, of sharp contrast, quiet conversations, or attempted conversations, sort of, between Jesus and Pilate, and then the roar of the crowd again back outside. Interesting technique he uses here.
Well, I get the impression that Pilate is afraid.
Yes.
Why is Pilate afraid, Ivan?
Well, that's what I was gonna raise the question for the group to answer. In verse 7, the Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he is claimed to be the Son of God." And when Pilate heard this,
He was
he was
even
more
afraid.
afraid. So what is there that is so...
Yeah.
I mean, does he know what it means that Christ claimed, according to what they claim, to be the Son of God? Why would he be afraid of that?
Let's ask
Let's
our
ask Bernard.
scholar in
Bernard.
residence.
I'm an Old Testament scholar.
Okay.
No, it's interesting. We all noted that as we went through.
Yeah.
And I'm hesitant, I guess, to, but not necessarily for good reason, to attribute to Pilate theological thought. And it may possibly be that is where this is going. That he is somebody who is involved at every level, and is perhaps tracking this, and he's looking for a political solution, and it keeps eluding him, and in quite typical fashion, questions are answered with questions, and so there is this
Something's
frustration,
going on
and it
here.
escalates in the
Yeah.
process.
Is Pilate related to somebody that he's concerned about, who
Well,
put
he's-
him in power?
Well, he's concerned about the Romans, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, he's in a power struggle. I mean, he's
Yeah.
between the Jewish people and their desire, and then his own governorship and the obligations that brings and so on. And really, I don't think he cares much for this people at all. But what's interesting is, 3 times in this whole episode as you went through it, I find no case against him. In
That's
chapter
right.
18, verse 38, I find no case against him. And then he's going to give the custom, of releasing somebody, but they want Jesus. And then again, in verse 4 of chapter 19, I find no case against him. Then just in verse 6, take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him.
Well, was it his wife who had a dream? Have nothing to do with this just man?
In the Gospel of Matthew, that's right.
Yeah.
I think the question that Pilate asks when the Jews say he claims to be the Son of God is interesting, because he goes inside and there's Jesus, and he says, "Where are you from?" Now, in many ways, in John, that's a key question.
That's a key
That's
question.
a very key question, and it's interesting that it comes now so near the end, and it's asked by this particular character. So the question, "Where are you from?" is the question that the whole gospel is about.
Yeah.
Where has Jesus come?
Yeah.
Who is he? Depends on where he's come. And then, as we saw when we looked at some earlier chapters, his identity is established on the cross. So there's a sense in which the answer to that question is about to be given as far as John's overall strategy is concerned. Am I right, New Testament scholars?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay.
Yes, and we see that, the hints of that, Rick, and now the repeated refrain also, not only I find no case again, but the refrain, this was to fulfill the scriptures.
Yes.
We see it, for example, in verse 24, again when he says, I thirst, again as he says that he's is finished, this too fulfills the scriptures. So Jesus is doing these things. And so there's a hint that there's a whole kind of divine agenda or program building up behind all of this, that keeps now surfacing at last. After all of the ambiguity and ambivalence through all of this gospel, now it's coming out. Yeah.
I think as well, sorry, that was a wasted slap.
I gotta ask
Who
a
did
question.
that?
I gotta ask. Go ahead, Bernie, and then I've gotta ask a
Then you
question.
slap the table.
Just further to what you were saying, Ivan, I see here clear reference to the focus of John never moves away from his audience,
Yeah.
because we have here the recognition that these people who are going to read this will be encouraged to hear from the lips of Pilate, I find no guilt in this man.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that would be powerful for them. You make your point, and then I want to come back in a different place.
No, that's a very interesting question. The question I was going to ask, which I think may not have occurred to ancient readers, but certainly does to people today. How is it that we hold individuals culpable, guilty, responsible for doing things that are prophetically predetermined? So it's like you've got this question of freedom and predestination coming out of the text here, when we say what they're doing is terrible, the ultimate crime in history perhaps from a Christian standpoint, yet at the same time all of this is taking place almost step by step in direct fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So what do we do with that? How would you answer somebody who asked you that question? I think we've all had that question asked at one time or another.
What happens
So
to
if you want to leave that and go back to your point, that's fine.
I remember in the book of Acts it says with Jesus, that what they were doing was to do everything that God's hand had predestined to take place.
Yes.
That actually is written that way in the book of Acts. So behind all of it, I mean, we have all kinds of human decisions and so on here, but behind it all there's a kind of sovereign, God's sovereignty stands behind. It doesn't get out of hand. That is to say, it doesn't get away from his ultimate plan. Although when you read it, you think sometimes it gets out of hand, because here are these people, crying for his crucifixion. What did this man really do, But God is behind this story, And the high point, I mean, when it says here, we have a law, according to that law, he ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God. We worry about, where in the law does it say such a thing? But the big thing is he claimed to be the Son of God. That's what John wants us to hear. He claimed to be the Son of God.
Could part of this be the fact that crucifixion, the fact that Jesus was crucified, posed such a tremendous challenge to the claim that Jesus was, in fact, the Messiah, the one in whom the promises to God's people were to be fulfilled? Because you've got this notion that would have been utterly scandalous, that whatever was hanged or hung on a tree, whichever is the right word there, was accursed of God. And so to preach that this person condemned to die and crucified was the pivotal figure in history would have generated enormous suspicion and opposition. And so what the author is doing is making a case for the fulfillment of prophecy in Jesus. So in fact, this is a part of God's plan.
Yeah, right.
In a paradoxical way.
Yeah.
I think this thing between human free will and divine intentionality is probably a bigger problem for us than it was for the ancients. They didn't seem to have the sense of inner contradiction. People could act as they chose to act, and as part of, as you said well, Ivan, the divine serene sovereignty over it all still works out the plan. And so I think John is simply not showing us not only the alternation between inside and outside, for example, but between the human level and the heavenly agenda at work here.
One more thought, if I may. This is something that would have become apparent after the resurrection. You don't have the picture that they're sitting here with a card in their hand and saying, okay, check by check,
Yeah.
I can see prophecy fulfilled. It was more a matter of what in the world is happening. You know, I mean, this would have been completely destructive of their frame of thinking and their expectations for Jesus. And it's only later on, as they look back and reflect on Jesus and what happened, in light of their understanding of scriptures, that they're able to pull these together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if you can just put it, I think is the same thing in a different way, as the story was told
Yeah.
in subsequent events, there were recognized to be familiar overtones and undertones from the Old Testament that in retrospect they perhaps could have recognized, not as a matter, like you said, of joining dots, but of waypoints along the way that now, looking back, this was familiar language and gave them confidence that behind it all God was acting.
And John kind of tries to signal that for us throughout his gospel, doesn't
Yes.
he? Because you've got several places where he says, the disciples saw this, but they didn't get it. But then afterwards, they remembered. And I think it's a kind of sanctified remembering, you know, and then they understood and believed. So I think you're right on target, Rick. This reflects the ongoing struggle in the early church to make sense out of all of this. And it didn't come easily.
Bernard.
For me, it's interesting how at the end of chapter 2, I believe, verses 23 to 25, when he was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival, many believed in his name because they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, would not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and needed no one to testify about anyone, for he himself knew what was in everyone. And what I hear John saying there is, as I tell my story, don't be surprised at what Jesus does. I'm not going to stop at every point and make it, because Jesus understood people and Jesus knew what he was about. And so now let's let the story unfold.
Yeah.
But back to chapter 19, there's a point here that listeners may have noticed, especially if they have a different version. We have a predominance of the New Revised Standard Version. For instance, if you take verse 19 of chapter 19, the inscription is put on the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And it's in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek in verse 20. When it says Hebrew, and that's what the Greek says, why do we say Aramaic?
Yeah, that's what mine
And
says. Yeah.
So some may be wondering about this,
Yeah.
and what are we denying? Nothing at all. You see, because on the one hand, it's called Hebrew, which seems to be the equivalent of what we talk about today as the Semitic languages.
Yeah.
It's a class of languages, but on the other hand, these names are Aramaic names. The tha on the end is the
Golgotha.
indication that this, in Hebrew, you put the definite article the or the equivalent at the beginning of the word. In Aramaic, it comes at the end of the word. And so these are clearly Aramaic words.
Golgotha,
Greek says Greek, yes.
Gabbatha.
Yes, that's the definite form of the word in Aramaic. So I just wanted to mention that there is no, there is a formal contradiction here, because the word that is used in Hebrew is the word for Hebrew in Greek, but it's a generic term, and the actual language is Aramaic that's being quoted here.
And that was the everyday language that people
Yeah.
in Palestine
Correct.
would have, so Jesus
Exactly.
would have spoken,
Yes.
that would have been his
Yeah,
language.
when he's quoted in a language other than Greek, it is in Aramaic. Talitha kum to Jairus' daughter, and so on.
And it is a pretty close cousin of classical Hebrew.
Like Portuguese and Spanish.
Yeah, that close.
Yeah.
So they were mutually intelligible. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting in verse 12,
Of chapter what?
Of 19. You know, Pilate's been finding no case in Jesus, and then all of a sudden here in verse 12, and from then on, Pilate tried to release him. He's intent on releasing
He is.
Jesus. Now, why is he so intent on releasing Jesus? Why does he care? Why does he care? Especially since the crowd wants him to die.
Well, don't you think he listened to his wife and the dream?
Well,
He's afraid. If you notice, all the time that we've been talking about Pilate, he's upset, then he's afraid, then he's more afraid. So why is he so afraid if he doesn't know something?
This is rather interesting because Josephus, the first century historian, would, if we only had Josephus, we would say Pilate is a cruel man who doesn't give a rip about anything. He's interested in raw power, and he does what he wants. But here we have some other kind of a Pilate
Something
who
different
is fearful, but it's probably a political fear that's involved here in some sense.
Yeah.
I can't imagine he's psychologically just fearful. But
Well, we know that the people who were in charge did not like to see the Jews have a problem or get a crowd together and, be exacting and what are you doing and so forth. So he's trying to keep everybody quiet, I'm sure.
well,
Because the Romans, they didn't like for the Jews to be upset and causing
he
a
doesn't.
problem.
The Romans don't want anything going on at the Passover season.
Yeah.
That's the season when the Jews came out of Egypt, and now they don't want anything stirred up here,
Yeah, that's
So
right.
the question behind the question, though, is why is John at such pains
Yeah.
to tell this?
Yes.
Because he could easily have done otherwise. These are the Romans. But here is somebody who seems to see more, and shortly there'll be an announcement from the Roman.
And now this is Carolyn Thompson for Searching for Answers.